The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we have Derek Schulze joining us. Derek initially carried out research in cardiac research and molecular screening of plant cell cultures before arriving at Niagara College in 2016 to teach for the School of Environment and Horticulture Studies. Derek and his wife Carlene put their academic research careers on hold to purchase and operate TJ greenhouses. The business supplied 156 major grocery stores throughout Ontario, with high-end bedding plants. The couple also operated their own hydroponic lettuce business. After 13 years, the family sold the business when Derek accepted a full-time position at Niagara College. Soon after arriving at Niagara College, Derek assisted his colleague Bill McDonald in creating the Commercial Cannabis Production Program, the first post-secondary credential of its kind in Canada. He has since left the cannabis program and returned to the Niagara College greenhouse, teaching a full schedule of courses to greenhouse technician students. Forever the scientist, Derek has made a point to include applied research learning into his greenhouse classroom. Now let's get into the episode with Derek. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Well, Happy New Year to everyone. Nice to be back with Senator.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Sorry you can't see me this episode. I'm not looking too good.
Well, we have a guest joining us today, so welcome Derek. Derek's in the greenhouse industry, and we're very excited to ask him some greenhouse-related questions for our next two episodes. Derek, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit of experience that you have in the greenhouse industry?
Sure, yeah. So my background was actually academic for quite a few years. I did basic science research, actually worked in the field of cancer research for quite some time, published, did talks, but kids came along and wanted to stay planted home more. And what better way than to anchor yourself with a farm? So we jettisoned and bought a greenhouse business, and we operated that for almost 15 years in the Niagara region in Ontario. And we were, like most in the ornamental sector, most greenhouses, we had a very diverse sort of business plan, right? We had our what we call daily wholesale sales. So every morning faxes come in and you're filling orders for the usual wholesalers that ship all over Canada and down into the States. And then we had our longer term contract deals, which were more of the bread and butter. In our case, we were aligned with Loblaws, which is a major grocery retailer in Canada, and we supplied just Ontario. So we were part of for the 10 years, we did both indoor and outdoor sales. So indoor would be the floral department inside the grocery stores, and then outdoor would be garden centers, right? We used to joke that we were much more of a logistics and trucking company than we were a farm, because when you're dealing with big chain stores, so much more of your time is occupied in logistics, right? Like when you're shipping to 156 garden centers in spring, that all happens in the span of 4 weeks. Really it should be 3.5. So you have lots of trucks, lots of drivers, and we would spend from basically the second Christmas was done, we would be cubing out our trucks for spring. So everything was already assigned, and the carts and the racks and the stores, everything came in on spreadsheets, and we knew what was going in the trucks long before spring came. So that was our life. We were a greenhouse grower, weekly, daily, and long-term contracts. And in the meantime, I started teaching part-time at Niagara College, teaching horticulture, dipping back into my days of undergraduate where I studied plant physiology, and that grew and grew. And now I've run the greenhouse program at Niagara College, and some cannabis investors bought our greenhouse for more money than it was worth. So we said, sure, why not? And now I teach full time. So I'm on my third career, probably looking for one more before I retire, because life is short and why just do the same thing, right? So that's me. That's my background.
What an interesting background, Derek. And I'm just curious, so how many different crops did you have at your greenhouse?
We have grown over the years lots of English ivy. We specialized in ivy topiaries. That was kind of our thing that we did to wholesalers. We did ivy hoops and standard balls at Christmas. We did standard 4-inch, 6-inch ivy, hanging baskets ivy. We also did a lot of potted Gerbera daisies. For the Loblaws Garden Center program, we did canna lilies, mandevilla standards, trailing vines, ivy. We did some fern stuff. We did some ground covers. The program with the Loblaws is somewhat dynamic. You have a couple of backbone products, but every year their buyers, they want to see something new and fantastic. It's tiring, actually. You get really stretched about those annual meetings. Like, okay, what's going to catch their eye this time to make sure that we can keep this ball rolling? So you always have something new coming out, right? But in the last couple of years, we put a section on and we started growing hydroponic lettuce. That took off. That was exhausting though. Lettuce is a quick crop and you're turning lots. I mean, it was just an experimental, it was like 10,000 square feet, but we were putting out 4,000 heads of lettuce a week. And we were also running our other business at the time. And my kids we were as a family, it was like the Von Trapp family, packing lettuce after dinner. And then I'd go to bed. I'd get up at 2, go to the wholesale terminal and dump a truckload and come home again. It was insane. We ended up selling the lettuce business to another greenhouse. They moved all the equipment over and they kept going with it. And it was sort of, we had to decide at that time, we were either going to go full steam into lettuce or Niagara College or do a scaled back ornamental in Niagara College. But then along came the cannabis company and that just made everything easy. So yeah, that's the kind of crops we grew.
Very interesting.
Derek, I'm excited to have you on as well. And just hearing you talk, the diversity of experience that you have and what you've learned. So I have a question for you. Can you explain why the greenhouse industry is in such a growth phase and why is North America become such a hotbed for growth? Now, I'm saying North America and maybe there's different pockets, whether it's Southwestern Ontario, whether it's Ohio, whatever, but I'm interested in your thought process, why the industry is growing so much.
I mean, the ornamental sector has undergone a lot of change over the last five or so years. Smaller operators like me, a couple acres in size, have mostly sort of gone over to cannabis investors, and larger companies have aggregated those sales. And at the same time, we have a boomer generation that is nearing retirement and they're very much into gardening. They have a lot of leisure time. They have quite a bit of expendable income. And so and then on top of that, the pandemic actually has been amazing for ornamental growers. Tropical sector, for example, has just exploded in terms of popularity. I think growing plants, especially when you have a world that's kind of chaotic, people like to nurture stuff and they like to see a plant and they like to have some success in their life. If it's a garden or a planter that they can be proud of. I don't know. It has changed, I mean, when I look at my garden center days, we've gone from selling, millions of cell packs where people buy all the little plants and plant out their garden, to selling complicated urns with all sorts of plants in them ready to go. The consumers want to hit the ground running. They don't want to plant a little cell pack and spend the first, 6 weeks waiting for their garden to form. They want big plants. So when they put them in the ground, the garden's beautiful immediately. But yeah, I think that's for the ornamental sector. The vegetable sector has been growing by leaps and bounds. It stumbled about 15 years ago a little bit. We had some export issues with the States. Actually, it was kind of all around the world. We even had a fight with Holland. Canada was concerned about dumping because they were dumping peppers on us. And that seems to be more of an issue over in Europe. But here, generally speaking, the vegetable sector is super, super strong. Greenhouses are adding minimum 10% every year of acreage. Prices don't seem to be slowing down. I remember reading a statistic. I don't know. I don't have the reference in my head, but it was something along the lines of the American population, which absorbs 60 to 70% of our produce. You should know that. The American population has been trying to improve its eating habits. Generally speaking, they went through a huge phase of obesity and stuff like that. Now people are kind of waking up and trying to eat a little healthier. this statistic basically said that if 1% of Americans decide to eat more vegetables, we have to add like 50% acreage.
Wow.
It's unbelievable potential in the U.S. market. And I think that we're just seeing that now, right? Like most of the greenhouse vegetable growers that I work with are adding about 25% every year to their acreage. And it's huge. And Canadians are, I'm proud. I'm a proud Canadian, but the Dutch have it figured out. We go to the Dutch for information to learn how to do it. We come back here and we emulate them. And we are very, very particular in how we do that to make sure we do the same thing as best as possible. And so Canadians are better growers than American growers. We consistently have higher yields, better quality. And so they can't keep up. The Americans just can't keep up. In fact, if you look at the big players in our sector, like Mucci, Mastronardi, they're actually moving into the States. I mean, they've always been there, but they're moving in force now, partly because of energy on the other side of the border, labor issues, border regulations, tariffs. But having said that, it's not without its challenges, right? I mean, when I had a greenhouse, I rented another greenhouse, and having two greenhouses in different locations is a bit of a nightmare. And finding qualified growers is also a big problem. So most of the guys up here will fly their growers down for 3 weeks and have them here for 3 weeks. They go back and forth, trying to keep the crops up and running until they get people in, whether it's North Carolina, Ohio, Michigan, California, Texas, try to get those farms up and running. But they are definitely, the vegetable sector, hugely successful. And with climate change, the unpredictable environment, variables like hail and wind and rain damage for outdoor grown produce, we don't have that issue as much with greenhouses. Hail and wind can be an issue, but not nearly as much as outdoor field production. And so then you have your vegetables, you've got your ornamentals and tropicals. Yeah, like definitely the future's bright.
And then you also have this upstart, certainly in Canada, and I think coming to the States even more so, is even cannabis as well. I know it's early stages and there's a lot of growing pains in many ways, but that certainly has added additional strength in the industry too, hasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, it's had a big impact. When I talk to ornamental and vegetable growers, they're kind of frustrated by it, but there's a new kid on the block, and that means that there's also new demand for skilled labor, for components. So it's driven the price up for building a new greenhouse has gotten more expensive because you've got this competition, right? There's been so much growth with cannabis greenhouses popping up that getting someone to build for you means you're paying a premium because they're busy. They're really busy. But yeah, no, cannabis is definitely, it's not going away, and it's not going to be tiny. It's definitely going to have an impact.
So it appears to me Niagara College is well positioned to take advantage or to actually provide the marketplace if there's such a demand. So you seem like in a real great position to offer that service to the marketplace for sure. I'm curious, historically, I know profitability is key, but I'm interested from your experience, as a grower or an owner, what are the key things that you would focus on as an operator?
It's hard to pick one.
Sure. And you could pick multiple, by the way.
Yeah.
If you could,
Farming
I know things are changing, so the priorities may change.
Well, there are the usual suspects that have been around for a long time, right? Like, so in Canada, some things are a bit unique. Like the Canadian border is something that we spend a lot of time keeping an eye on. We have a really bizarre system in Canada where the government can change rules and they have no obligation to tell you. It's up to you to constantly read all the documentation about the border to make sure you're up to speed. And our various organizations are not always on top of getting all that information out. So we're always monitoring the border. That seems to be a dynamic thing. Trucks get held over. We end up with fights over bugs that are in a truck. And there's been some big things. So we keep an eye on that. Labor is a big one, although that is kind of settling down. Offshore labor is something we rely heavily on, Mexicans and Jamaicans primarily. And most of those offshore laborers that we bring in have been working at the farms for many years already. There's an established relationship. The government has also mandated better housing. So we have, better accommodations. So yeah, labor is something you have to keep an eye on all the time. Obviously energy, that's a big one. On your books, energy and labor are almost the same cost to an operation. So in that sense, you have some labor saving things you can do, like conveyors or robots for transplanting. And there's some things you can do for energy, but they both have times when your hands are tied. Something has to get done, right? You need heat in the greenhouse one way or the other, or you need 500 pots moved in 5 minutes, But so yeah, energy, labor, our border those are probably the three. And, there's pest management, that's farming. But yeah, energy and labor are your biggest two.
Okay. Interesting about the border, because that's never been brought up in the past, Derek. That's such.
Oh, it can be a nightmare. I remember probably about 10 years ago, we had a moth that got into our greenhouses from Holland. It was called Depancellia. And the Americans closed the border immediately. And they started the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which is responsible for overseeing greenhouses and allowing us to have an export permit stamp in-house so we can do our own certification for our documentation. The CFIA was going around confiscating millions of dollars worth of crops trying to stamp out this moth. It wasn't until they showed up at one of the large operators, Westbrook, at that time, and they tried to discard a whole, like a few $1 million worth of bulbs that they had just brought in from Holland. And Westbrook said, enough's enough. We're suing you because this moth has been around for 15 years already. We know it's in the States. And you can go on the internet, and you could see that in, state of California have been dealing with this moth already for 5 years. So this is a classic example of the Americans just playing with us. And so the CFIA, our government doesn't really they don't stand up for us much. They're kind of just when it comes to the border. So it wasn't until Westbrook said, enough's enough. They won the lawsuit. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The Americans opened the border again. It was like oh, okay. So that was, I would say, in the 15 years of me operating our greenhouse, we had about 4 similar incidents. So it's not that uncommon. So you keep an eye on these things, right? What's new and emerging right now? It's Japanese beetle.
Right.
There's always something.
Right.
Derek, can I follow on? We've asked you what the major focus was, and you've given us 3, which is good because one of those is a focus that I'm particularly interested, which is in energy. And I was just thinking about this. You clearly articulated something about energy there. But in your experience, and I'm slightly changing from what we've talked about beforehand on this, but in your experience, how skilled is the average greenhouse operator in being able to deal with the energy issue and energy costs?
I would say pretty skilled, actually. The greenhouse operators, we know our boilers very well. We know how to tune them. We know how to operate them for peak efficiency. We know how to operate our heating system as a unit for peak efficiency. I think a lot of times people underestimate the complexity of operating a hot water heated greenhouse. You have, for example, you have under bench heat, you have perimeter heat, we have activation pipes, we have under gutter pipes. They're all used at different temperatures, different times of the day to maintain a suitable climate, to make it disease-free, to make the air move, to prevent cold spots. And you sit there in front of your computer and you're constantly graphing everything. Every greenhouse operator, when they come into the greenhouse, and the first thing they do is they plot the graphs from last night. They'll look at what were the temperatures of my zones. Did anything fall behind? Because if you had a temperature drop for some reason, something wasn't working right. Maybe there's a pump that's tripped out and you have to go to your boiler room and find out of the myriads of pumps if any one of them is somehow not working. And I guarantee you, there are always maintenance issues. So you have to be on top of it. You have to know your system. When you walk in the front door, just by listening, you can tell if something's not right. It's hard to describe, but you sort of become one with your greenhouse and you know when something's not right. And energy is something that we pay close attention to. It's also something that's a lot easier to control, right? Like it's up to you to make sure you're using your system efficiently. If you're being lazy and not paying attention, then you're missing out on potential savings. I installed a large buffer tank in our greenhouse 5 years before we ended with it. That was huge. It was a big investment. I mean, we had to get huge tank and all sorts of construction and everything, but that buffer tank, I had done the math and it proved true. It worked really, really well. It allowed us to run our boiler on low fire through peak demands during the day because you're able to integrate that heat over hours where we didn't need it. And then when you come to the morning and the evening are the two peak demands in a greenhouse. That's when your highest heat load is. And so running the boiler on low fire meant that, it had higher efficiency because we had temperature probes in the stack and we can watch what's coming out the exhaust because that's lost heat, right? But yeah, to answer your question, we are very, very much in tune. And the average grower has to be skilled or they won't be in business.
So really, as well as being, for want of a better word, a farmer, you've got to be a half decent engineer.
Oh, absolutely. I would say I was an average grower and, I built, I'm probably going to get into this. I built my own wood heat system for
Respect.
over a year and a half and ran that for the last number of years. Now that was at the same time, this is when a lot of us in the greenhouse industry switched to wood. Dave probably remembers because at that time we were paying, I'm cubic per cubic meter. I was paying 52 cents a cubic meter for gas.
Like $14 a G.
It was unbelievably expensive. I mean, look at what we're paying now, right? We're well below that now. So yeah, we're skilled people. We know how to do wiring. We know computer controls, industrial controls. We know how to operate boilers, how to maintain boilers. I've pulled burners off boilers with hoists and reworked them and put them in again. Like the average grower and a greenhouse grower knows this stuff. They have to.
That's good. That's good to hear. Just whilst on that, so you're really good at that side of it. How good is the average greenhouse operator, should we say, at understanding the energy markets and about, who they should contract with, tariff rates and things like that?
Yeah, you know what? I'll tell you how my circle of growers did it. And that was basically just call around and ask what everyone else knows and what they're doing and what they found. Just word of mouth.
Yeah.
We don't get on the internet and shop markets. I think that the vegetable sector does. You have to draw a line between ornamental and vegetable because the gas consumption is different. We would typically sign 1 to 3 year contracts. I don't think many people went beyond 3 years. And where the vegetable sector, they actually they spot buy on the market and stuff like that. They are spending a lot more time. They're probably get in the morning, look at their graphs on the boiler, and the next thing they look at is probably graphs on energy.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that, Dave?
I think Derek's just relate is very common. I think a lot of people, it's a word of mouth. And so as long as they get information from a trusted party, I think it serves them well. But there are some people in the industry that are, they operate a little differently in the pricing they give. It may or may not be the best, and they may not know that. So there's just different people in the marketplace. So I think it's good that you're searching out and finding people that you trust that can help you solve that market or give you the market knowledge. And it's not only for the commodity itself that Derek's describing, but it's also dealing with transportation and even working with the utilities, like working with, because there's different rates and rate options. So there's a variety of things that growers can do. And, it serves them well if they're proactive in that for sure.
Okay. So sort of moving on a bit, it was quite interesting when you were talking about what you have to do to satisfy the retail supply chain and the customer and everything else. And I want to sort of roll that into current things that are going on. We've just had COP26 on climate change. climate change is a big issue, carbon footprinting, talking about carbon labeling possibly of products. How do you see this whole aspect having either positive, negative impact on the greenhouse industry? Is it a threat? Is it an opportunity? What's your view on that?
Yeah, well, I don't have a crystal ball for sure how it will play out, but what complicates this topic is, I mean, we live in a world full of information, some of it good, some of it bad. And people can look at a greenhouse and see a chimney and a bunch of steam coming out and they say, well, that's bad. That's a carbon footprint. But what they don't see is efficiency. What they don't see is what's your yield per gigajoule? What's your yield per ton of carbon? And so I have this discussion with my students a lot because this generation of children has come up through an educational system that has sort of prepped them for a greener future. And I think that there's a lot of misinformation out there. I can point to a couple of really interesting studies that were done. And again, pointing to studies is something I love to do as a science guy, but I'm also very frustrated by it because unfortunately, even science is confusing because you can find studies that support whatever you want now, which is unfortunate. But I tend to look for studies that are in what we call peer-reviewed journals and are in reputable journals, okay? So I don't just look up +1 articles that no one ever has checked. So anyways, decent journal articles that have looked at the economics and large aggregate commercial farms are still more efficient on a per carbon consumption for producing food than your little organic farm or even a locally produced vegetable in the city. Because, for example, a lot of times they think, oh, local's better. We got to buy it was grown right here in Toronto.
Yeah.
But what they don't understand is that, okay, that I can kind of make sense, but let's think about this. Everything you needed to grow that tomato in that warehouse in Toronto, all your inputs had to be driven to your location. Now, Ontario's Leamington segment is this small area that has almost 80% of Canadian locally grown produce is grown in that area. And it's aggregated, it's centralized. Everything you need is in that area. And it's brought in bulk, it's efficient. And then when it's finally produced, the footprint for distributing is actually minimal because we're dealing with such high densities and efficient distribution systems. When you get into local farms, right, then you have higher energy costs. So long story short, it's a complicated answer because you have to deal with people's perceptions and sorting out truth from fiction.
So I think what's really interesting there is that there's clearly a major educational piece is required, and I feel that some of what you're saying now, I do a lot of work in both energy and sustainability, and I find too many people want binary answers to questions. This is good, that's bad. And I don't know about in North America, but we've got this month, January. This is the month to go vegan. So to have an entirely plant-based diet. It's also the same month to give up alcohol. This to me doesn't seem like a good combination, but that's just a personal, the personal view.
Sales will go to the roof.
Yeah, but what happens is, I know one or two, and I'm going to be bit blunt here. I know one or two fundamental vegans who believe that this is going to save the world and everything else. But like you say, they are, shall we say, operating on limited science, limited knowledge, and much more about, shall we say, general philosophy than fact. So I possibly all of us involved in these things have got to do more to get people to understand it. The problem we've got, though, is it's an incredibly complex subject to explain to people, isn't it?
I really respect Hillary Clinton. I don't know if you
heard of her. Yeah.
Hillary Clinton, but she's a fascinating woman and very intelligent. And she failed in her bid to become president of the United States.
Yeah.
All of that. Okay. And we saw the outcome, and we are still living the outcome. And if you listen to Hillary Clinton and her explanation as to why she failed, it is because she decided she was incapable of distilling complex problems into simple answers. And if you listen to her interviews, because she is so intelligent, she gave too much detail, and the
Yeah.
average American just couldn't understand, and they dismissed her. And so I think that as a greenhouse sector, this is I don't know that we're doing a good job, but we do somehow have to distill these complex ideological laden topics into something that the average person can absorb in 5 seconds.
Yeah.
You know what?
We-
Derek, that's a challenge that John and I have had in the last 25 years when people should be managing energy, because it's so complex, and trying to make it simple so they understand it it's a daunting task for sure.
Because we are in the era of the soundbite, aren't we? And I was just thinking, it's interesting. You know, you look at we've got to be careful here, talking slightly politics, but you look at politics south of your border, and you wonder, what was it somebody said about, imagine how ignorant the average person is, and then realize half the population is more ignorant. And you've got this thing, isn't it, that what people can understand, want to understand, and how you present it to them. And I think we've also got the problem of the short attention span, haven't we? That people, if they can't get the answer quickly, don't want to go in depth with it. So, yeah, interesting.
I think that the greenhouse sector is definitely trying to address this, right? You look at companies, their websites, they have websites on their product and QR codes. Whether customers look at that or not, I don't know. But the greenhouse sector has always done its best to be very efficient with the energy that it consumes. We don't just dismiss it and burn it without a second thought. We collect as much of the carbon dioxide that we can, and we pump it into the greenhouse as fertilizer. We put economizers on our exhaust stacks to scavenge waste heat, to heat warehouses or low-grade heat areas. We've done everything we can to be as efficient because we're a business. And I think that that's where, if we're allowed to talk ideology, I don't care whether you're a Republican or Democrat. What I care about is, I think businesses offer the best solutions to our future, because business is the ultimate democracy, right? You're making money or you're not. You can eliminate ideology, because when it comes time to pay the bank, they don't care. It's the profit.
True.
So I think the free market is how I see us solving this, and government meddling never helps. They often get it wrong. They have the good intentions, like carbon credits and stuff. Like, a lot of greenhouses are upset about that, carbon tax. But, the flip side is, if the market, we still have low pricing, there's a bit of a disconnect, and they're trying to accelerate. They got to do something to sort of push the businesses to make those decisions. But I hope that carbon pricing doesn't stay, but whatever.
Yeah, it's just finishing on that, your comment there about businesses. That was one of the big takeaways from COP26, where a number of observers and people involved in it said governments aren't really going to get to grips with this. Business has got to do something about it.
And what's really interesting here is consumers want it. So from a business perspective, it's a powerful marketing tool, right? So you just have to figure out how to turn this into a narrative that the customer will say, hey, I want that tomato because it's got that blue sticker. And I know the blue sticker means that they're certified by X.
Yeah. And Derek, I want you to know that certainly it's our opinion as well that the business can lead in many areas for all the reasons that you just said. They get the right signals, they can move. There's not bottom line driven, so they're driven and they measure that all the time versus being restricted. So I do believe businesses in the greenhouse industry have and will continue and can continue to lead in this energy/carbon area as well.
Derek, you mentioned so many good points this episode. I do want to emphasize, I really liked your point on, making sure you're simplifying the answer. And that's kind of something that we hope to do with this podcast, right? a lot of times people look at energy and carbon and see it as a really complicated issue, but it's all of our problems, right? Like everyone needs to be involved in their energy and carbon consumption. So our goal is kind of to simplify that. And thank you so much for kind of starting that conversation in the greenhouse and energy industry as well. To conclude this episode, what is your biggest takeaway for our listeners? So what is a common misconception in the greenhouse industry? And I know you mentioned a few, but what would you kind of want to give our listeners?
Yeah, I think that when people are looking, especially for produce, when people are looking at a greenhouse grown pepper, I want them to understand that it was grown using the absolute most efficient means possible and was grown responsibly, and not to see it as this huge, ugly carbon footprint that, if we can make a tomato and a pepper and grow it not too far from your house, maybe within 200, 300, 400 miles, that can be a problem solver for us. It's not a problem to solve. A problem might be, do you need to have a mango in January? That might be more of a, maybe you can wait till some, I don't know. I just want people to see that the greenhouse product is not dirty. That's what I want them to see.
Well, thank you for that, Derek. Any final comments, Dave and John?
No, it's always a joy talking to Derek because he calls it the way he sees it, which is it's a breath of fresh air. And actually, I think, again, every time I speak to him, there's stuff that I learned about the greenhouse industry, like the logistics of playing such a big issue. Yeah, I see these trucks parked all the time, whether it's ornamentals or, so I understand that the importance. And actually, I will say to Derek, I think there's going to be an opportunity in the energy market for those trucks for electrification going forward. So I think there's more opportunities there.
Yep.
John?
Yeah, I think the fact, Derek, that you are an educator and that you are talking the way you are, I think is great cause for hope.
Agreed. Well, thank you, Dave, John, and Derek for this episode. I look forward to talking to you soon.
Look forward to the next episode, Derek.
Yeah. Bye for now.
Right.
Thank you.
Cheers.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.